Well, there's a little phrase in that sketch which strikes me as being very profound. Joseph says, it's like Mary said, you just have to be willing. You just have to be willing. And those words, I think, contain a wonderful truth about how God works to accomplish his plans and purposes in our world. Mary and Joseph had to be willing to be part of God's plan to save the world by becoming the parents of this very special child. Mary said in that reading, I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. I think that her reply was crucial in everything, for things to proceed as the angel had said. And it was the same for Joseph. If we read in Matthew's Gospel, we read that the angel appeared to him in a dream to explain God's plan. We read that when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel asked him or commanded him, and took Mary home to be his wife. He didn't have to, but he chose to. I believe they both had free choice in the matter. Well, God being God, perhaps knew how they were going to respond, but that doesn't get away from the fact that they had free choice. It doesn't get away from the fact that they had an incredibly difficult decision to make. Imagine Mary standing in front of that angel, trembling, I would imagine, receiving the astonishing news. She had been chosen to bear the child of God. All kinds of thoughts rushing through her mind about how that was going to work out. All kinds of fears, I would imagine, about what it would mean for her further down the line. It was a momentous decision. She was very likely just a young teenager, certainly from a very ordinary background. Nothing about her which made her especially suited for this great task, except for one thing. She was willing. She was willing to do what God asked of her. Mary said yes. She overcame those fears and simply put her trust in God, and she set out well into the unknown, pretty much, simply because God asked her to do that. And yes, likewise for Joseph, he was willing too. Well, not at first perhaps, not surprisingly. What a shock to hear that Mary was pregnant, his fiancée. And he knew he wasn't the dad. But because God asked him to, he took on the role of being the dad for this special child. And not only did he make that initial decision, but he clearly followed it through to the full. We just have a few snippets, really, of information about Joseph in the Bible, but it shows quite clearly that he took this role very seriously. He looked after Mary and the baby at the birth. Probably wasn't so thrilled at the state of the delivery room, but he found them a place. A month or so later, he saw to it that Jesus was presented at the temple in the proper way. He then had to protect Jesus from Herod, taking the family to Egypt as refugees after the birth. And later brought the family back to settle in Nazareth, to their home. If you remember, he was as concerned as Mary when at the age of 12 Jesus went missing on an outing to Jerusalem. And they searched and searched till they found him at the temple. And we also know that Joseph trained Jesus up as a carpenter to follow in his own footsteps. Well, almost certainly Joseph had died before Jesus began his public ministry. He probably was quite a lot older than Mary. But he'd faithfully seen his task through, the task that God had given him, because he was willing. God does not force anyone to do anything. He has plans, plenty of plans, which will come to fruition one way or another. But if we want to be part of those plans, then we have to be willing. We have that free choice. God also, I think, has very specific plans for our individual lives, particular things he wants me and you to do. As it says in Ephesians, good works that he's prepared in advance for us to do. But we have to be willing. We have to be willing and choose to do those things that he asks us to do. The great thing is we don't have to be anyone special to do things for God. In fact, quite the reverse seems to be true. God seems to prefer to use very ordinary people with not a lot on the face of it to commend them. And sometimes he uses the people we least expect. Another line I like from that sketch is when Joseph says, God chose a couple of nobodies like us. He did choose a couple of nobodies in the world's eyes, but then God's estimation of people's worth is a lot different from ours. When God asked Mary and Joseph to carry out this important job for him, he was in fact continuing a pattern that he'd established throughout the Bible. In fact, it's hard to find an instance where God actually chose someone that we might number among the great in our world. Sometimes he raised people up to become great by the world's standards. But usually he starts with ordinary people who, with nothing much to make them stand out from the crowd. For example, there's that story of David being chosen to be king, the least likely from among all of his brothers. But God chose him, and he turned out to be the greatest king Israel had. Or the disciples, who were fishermen and tax collectors and the like. And the establishment of the Church of Christ depended on such as these. Status doesn't much matter in God's eyes, or having the right connections. Wealth doesn't matter. Even having great talent doesn't necessarily matter, or great intelligence. In fact, some of these things may even detract from our ability to serve God. Worldly status and power can make us unwilling to be sent by God to serve those who we perhaps feel are beneath us. Wealth can make us too comfortable to make the kinds of sacrifices that God calls us to make. Having great talent can make us too dependent on our own ability to do things, instead of relying on God and doing things his way. What we do have to be is willing to be used by God. That's his number one quality in the people he looks for. Willing, like Noah, to build a boat despite the apparent foolishness of what God asked him to do. Willing, like Abraham, to pack up his worldly belongings and set off even though he didn't know where he was headed, because God said so. Jonah's an interesting case. He did actually refuse to do what God wanted at first. God had to employ a bit of persuasion. But nevertheless, ultimately, Jonah still decided to go to Nineveh and preach God's message. God used a bit of persuasion with Moses too. He had all sorts of excuses why he shouldn't be the one to go and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. In that case, God was just very patient with him, gradually answering his questions, convincing him that God would be with him, to equip him for that task, to give him the confidence to go. But again, ultimately, Moses had to just set one foot in front of the other and set off to Egypt. Or again, we could think of the disciples, who when Jesus called them to follow him, they just gave up everything, their homes, their jobs, and followed him. But of course, Jesus himself, as always, sets the greatest example. We can look at his whole life as being one of obedience to his Father, hearing what was being asked of him to do and humbly following the path God chose for him. Even Jesus had to make real choices to follow God's plan. Even in the most extreme situations, when asked to go to his death, Jesus, not without facing a load of anguish, was willing. Your will be done, he said. He was willing to go to the cross because his Father asked him to. And he did that for us, of course, which at the end of the day is the most compelling reason why we should also be willing to follow God's way for us in gratitude, in response to the sacrifice Jesus made for us. Are you willing to be used by God? Are you willing to give your life to be used by God? You may feel you've not got much to offer, little to offer in terms of talent or resources, or even great faith. But if that's the way you feel, well, I'd say that's a good sign. It's a sign that you're the sort of person that God can use and actually likes to use. You don't have to be someone who stands out from the crowd in any way. You don't have to have great experience or great self-confidence. Let's face it, Mary had absolutely no experience at all when it came to bearing children and raising them. It was all completely new, but that didn't matter. You just have to be willing and have that genuine desire to serve God. If so, then God will use you to do things for him. He will open up opportunities. I don't know what that will mean for you. I don't know, because God has different plans for each of us. All I know is if you are willing, God will find a way to lead you into a life lived for him, to accomplish good works for him. And I don't mean necessarily to give you astonishing feats to perform. There's plenty of those to be read about in the Bible, of course. Plenty of things that you and I will actually never be asked to do for God. Although the exciting thing is we can never limit what he might do with any one of us. Look at the Christmas story again. But mostly, our serving him will be in very ordinary ways, in everyday ways. Just helping to care for others, praying for others, encouraging others, serving in different ways in the church. And at home too, bringing up children in a way that God approves of, as Mary and Joseph did. And of course, sharing our faith with others. God asks us all to do that. Mary, through her obedience in bearing God's child in her own body, made herself a kind of a gateway for God coming into the world and coming into the lives of the people of this world. And when you think about it, God does ask a similar kind of thing to us, to be the bearers of Christ to others, allowing his Spirit to live in us and then to overflow from us to others as we share what we know of him in words and deeds. And that sharing of our faith is usually done in very down-to-earth ways, through very simple words and actions taken when the opportunity arises. God not only works through ordinary people, he also works through the ordinary things that people do. Even our seemingly insignificant and faltering words and actions, if they're offered with a willing heart, can be used by God to great effect. Look what Jesus did with 5 loaves and 2 bits of fish when a little boy just offered them to him. We just have to be willing. We just have to be available to God, to live with that mindset of wanting to be used by God. That should be in our prayers every day. Lord, please use me today to serve you. Guide my thinking, my steps. Lead me into situations where you want me to be today. Help me to recognize the opportunities when they arise to serve you, and help me to have the courage to take those opportunities when they come. If we enter each day with a willing heart of that kind, then God will use us, and he will bless us for being willing to be his agents in the world. It doesn't mean we'll be shielded from pain and suffering in life. It's no good believing that's a part of the deal, because it's not. It's not what it's about. We can see that very clearly again from the lives of Mary and Joseph. the crises they went through. Just as they did, we live in a world that is broken, a world that's not what God wants it to be. And we're all caught up in that. We can't avoid being hurt sometimes. The road ahead may be tough. Mary had the immense honour of bearing the Son of God. She also had to suffer the immense anguish of watching him die in horrendous circumstances. And yet her faith stayed strong. God saw her through it all. And Jesus himself shows us that the path of obedience to God is a path that contains or involves suffering. We have to accept that fact. Someone once said that we are all wounded healers as we seek to bring wholeness into the lives of others. I like that description. It seems so true. We're all wounded healers. And in that we follow in the footsteps of Jesus, by whose wounds we are healed, the Bible tells us. It's another part of our ordinariness that we face the same trials as others do. It's another part of our ordinariness that God can and does use us to the benefit of others, even in the midst of our trials. God has many works, lots of little works that need to be done. And if we are willing, he will do them through you and me. He so dearly wants you and I to cooperate with him in bringing his love into the lives of others. And if we do, that will bring great blessing to us as well along the way. There's no better way to live our lives. There was a lovely thing just came to mind there. Did you see on the TV that old chap who'd spent 12 or 20 Christmases by himself? And this came to the light of BBC TV, and so they sent a family in to give him a Christmas tree and give him some company, and they sent a whole choir to sing outside his house on Christmas at Christmas. And there was a lovely thing because I heard one of the girls in the choir being interviewed afterwards, and she said, "I'm now want to be a carer," she said. She said, because I felt so happy because I'd made this man happy that I now know what I want to do. And it was just a lovely little instance of what is so true. The only way to be happy in life is to make others happy. That's how it works. We have to give ourselves. And that's exactly what God asks us to do. As Joseph said in that sketch, it's like Mary says, you just have to be willing.